Good afternoon and welcome to the final panel of the Executive Branch Review. We will be discussing judicial nominations and confirmations. I'm Andy Oldham from the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and it's my great honor to moderate this panel. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We will start, as is the custom, with introductory remarks from our three distinguished panelists. Then we'll have plenty of time for discussion between the panelists, including Q&A from y'all in the audience. When it comes to the Q&A, the easiest way to ask a question is by using the raised hand button. I'll see your hand, and just like in a live conference, I can call on you. Please note that you will need a working microphone to use this option. Alternatively, you can send text-based questions through the Q&A tab in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There's also a chat tab for attendees to chat with each other, but please don't use the chat tab to ask questions. If you do, I might not see your question, and I would hate to miss it. So please either use the raised hand function or the Q&A function if you would like to participate. Now, I could spend our entire 90-minute panel recounting the illustrious careers of our panel members, but to keep us on task, to keep the panel from blushing, and to keep the rest of us from feeling inadequate, I'll be brief. I commend to you, however, their full bios, which are in your program materials. Our first panelist this afternoon is Carrie Campbell Severino. She is the Chief Counsel and Policy Director of the Judicial Crisis Network. She appears frequently on television and other media to discuss today's topic. She's also the co-author with Molly Hemingway of the best-selling book, Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Court. I would also note that Mrs. Severino clerked for my favorite Court of Appeals judge in the nation, Judge David B. Sentell of the DC Circuit, before clerking for Justice Thomas. Our second panelist will be Neil Eggleston. He currently serves as a litigation partner at Kirkland & Ellis. Before that, he had an extraordinarily distinguished career in public service, including 2 stints in the White House counsel's office. He served as President Obama's White House counsel from 2014 to 2017 and associate counsel to President Clinton from 1993 to 1994. So he's obviously seen a lot of judicial nominations and confirmations. Neil started his career by clerking for Judge James Hunter III on the Third Circuit and Chief Justice Berger. Last, but certainly not least, we are honored to be joined today by Ambassador C. Boyden Gray. He is the founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates, a law and strategy firm in Washington, D.C., focused on constitutional and regulatory issues. Experience in the White House. He worked there for 12 years, first as counsel to the vice president during the Reagan administration, and then as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush. So he too has seen the front lines of many, many, many judicial nominations and confirmations. Mr. Gray is a Marine and a former law clerk to Chief Justice Warren. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Severino to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Judge Oldham. It's great to be here, and I really am excited to be part of this conference and experience this new format that we have. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. So today we're talking about the judicial nominations under this new executive administration that we're dealing with here. And I think some of the main, I'll kind of give a summary of some of the main features that I see coming up here. First of all, one of the key things that any president has as their in their toolkit here, I suppose, is judicial nominations of things they can do. They obviously sign legislation, they have the bully pulpit, et cetera, but they do have judicial nominations to make. And that's something that President Biden is just at the front end of getting involved in. Right now, we don't have a incredibly long list of nominees that he has been able to get involved in so far, simply because he's only been there a while and has obviously, with other things on his plate, has not gotten to them as quickly as some administrations have. So up for this moment, he is at this point in his administration, he's coming in with about just over 100 vacancies, 111. That's just short of where Donald Trump started in office, where he came into office with 121 vacancies. Currently, there's 111 for Biden, and that does include a few that have come up since he took office. 15 of those are on the Court of Appeals, and 96 of those are in the district courts, the Court of Federal Claims, et cetera. Right now, so far, he's got 18 nominees up for those positions, and we are just at the point where we have started having some of those nominees being voted out of committee. In fact, just a couple votes out of committee today were the first ones that we have really seen getting through the process. Now, this is a little bit slower than President Trump, who obviously came into office with a Supreme Court vacancy right in front of him, and was getting, he had, I think his first appellate nominee went through in March. So that it's a little bit behind that process, but still, obviously, it's very early. So it's hard to predict what we'll see in terms of the pace of judicial nominations. One thing that the Biden administration has done, which I heartily commend, is the removal of the AB, or the continuing refusal to give the ABA a privileged place in the judicial nomination process. This is something that used to be done by many presidents, where they would give judicial nominees names to the ABA before announcing them publicly, and then have the ABA do its ostensibly nonpartisan analysis of these nominees before they would release these names. Often, if they didn't get a well-qualified vote, they then wouldn't release the name. But it gave the ABA really an outsized role in the process, and a quasi-governmental role in sort of vetting those judges. I think that's inappropriate. First of all, simply because giving any outside group that role, I think, seems inappropriate if this is the job of the president in his administration to be doing the vetting of judges, not an outside group. But also because a lot of concerns have been raised as to the ABA's own bias in that process, both, and then they've been documented empirically, both bias against conservatives and bias against women and minorities. And some of this may stem from the factors that they look at in terms of the type of experience they're looking for, the number of years of experience, but also we've observed that in certain cases where you have people that didn't meet their objective numbers of years of experience, they were more likely to give a pass to that, or bypass those objective standards when they were progressive or liberal judges versus conservative judges. And there's concerns about that as well. So I'm happy that President Biden has followed President Trump's lead in giving the ABA a backseat in this process. They're certainly welcome to do those evaluations, but it's not something that I think should take first. They should get a first crack before anyone else gets to see those nominations. And I'll note that this is something that only Republican presidents had done up until now, and they got a lot of pushback. So I'm glad to see that now this is a bipartisan agreement that the ABA shouldn't have that special outsized role. Another area of that I think is going to be really important in terms of the courts with the Biden administration is the issue of court reform, and particularly court packing. This is something that's been important since the campaign, and it's something that we've seen particularly pushed by some of the liberal dark money groups that have this as a top priority, it seems. It's something that they had kind of tried to inject into the nomination process during the Democratic primary. And at that point, interestingly, the nominees across the board seem to be open to the idea of court packing, with the exception of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, who said he thought it wasn't a good idea. And probably a lot of you have seen the clips of him from the 80s saying not only that it wasn't a good idea, but that it was a bonehead idea, and hearkening back to FDR and saying that he was that was a abuse of power and that he shouldn't have been trying to pack the court back in 1937. Now, of course, we see a different approach. So this time in last year, we had Biden saying he didn't think it was a good idea. That shifted after he became the nominee. And I would say it's a matter of concern that it also shifted as he was receiving over $100 million in assistance in his campaign from some of these same dark money groups that are advocating for court packing. But if he shifted to a position where he wasn't actually willing to disclose what he thought about court packing, and said, and it was almost like one of those, you have to vote for the bill to find out what's in it. You have to vote for me to find out whether I'm in favor of court packing. Then he moved to the position of, well, I'm going to appoint a commission. So I don't even know whether I'm for court packing, but I'll have a commission that will decide this. Well, that is what we've now seen appointed. And actually the first meeting of that commission was yesterday. It is a 3-dozen-member commission. Of those 3 dozen members, they kind of span the spectrum of, there's a lot of academics and thinkers, but there's also people from the advocacy world. But the members of that commission are very heavily weighted in favor of liberal activists, including people like Lawrence Tribe, who literally wrote the book on how to bork. That was what his book was, what inspired the campaign against Robert Bork. He's one of the people who came up with the idea of filibustering appellate judges on a partisan basis in the first place, that got us to kind of where we are now, when we had the filibustering during the Bush era, and then the nuclear option, et cetera. So this is, I think, if personnel is policy, the choice of the members of this commission are really telling in terms of the outcome that this administration is hoping to get. And yes, they included a handful of moderate Republicans to give it a bipartisan veneer, but it's not a commission where, if you look at the members, you have any question as to what direction this is going to go. My personal assumption is that the goal of the commission is really to provide political cover for the president as he changes his own position from, again, his strong opposition to court packing to what will presumably be support for it. Although I frankly think the commission probably will come up with whatever is politically beneficial the result at the time that it comes out with its results, which will be roughly 6 months from now. Whatever is politically beneficial for the administration to do at that point will probably be approximately what they come up with, and then we'll give him cover to do that. Unless by that point it turns out that court packing continues to be as unpopular as it is now, and frankly as unpopular as it was in the FDR era, at which point FDR, who was a president who was incredibly popular, who had a strong support in Congress, even then it was viewed as beyond the pale to pack the court for that. And he also gave sort of nonpartisan excuses for packing the court. He said, "Oh, the judges are getting older, et cetera, and they need help on the court." There hasn't even been an effort to make those kind of arguments at this point. I think it's very clear. The argument is Donald Trump had his nominees. We don't like that, and we think we should add nominees to balance that out. It's no surprise that this bill that then was proposed to pack the court didn't wait for any commission, didn't wait to see, I wonder what the academics will say about this. It is simply, they put out a bill, and Donald Trump had 3 nominees to the court. This surprisingly would just give Biden right off the bat 4 nominees. So we see your 3 nominees, Donald Trump, and we give you 1 more to Joe Biden. So I think that it makes it pretty clear what the political angle is. And I think another theme that is a concern to me is seeing the intimidation of judges. And I think that the court packing is one area in which that is happening because people, you've heard some of the advocates of this court packing even explicitly, effectively say, hey, Justice Breyer, if you don't want the court to be packed, you should just retire and give us a seat to fill right now. It's that kind of move that makes me very concerned that this is being used as a threat to the court, to the justices who are on the court, that if you don't rule in ways that make the loudest voices on the left happy, that we will then alter the court in a way that almost all of Americans acknowledge, apart from the extreme groups on the left, would not actually be good for the country. Yes, they're considering some other court reforms in there as well, some of which would make more sense than others, but many of which would require difficult things like a constitutional amendment. But I think it's very clear that the real action and the real move here is to try to increase the size of the court, and maybe as a close second to add a bunch of seats to lower courts in a pretty overtly partisan attempt to get the kind of nominees that the liberal dark money groups want to see on the courts. There's a lot more to say, but I want to leave a lot of time for our other panelists, so I'll hand it off to Neil Eggleston.
Thank you, Carrie, for those comments, but mostly I want to thank the Federalist Society for inviting me to be a member of this panel. As the judge said during the introductions, I was the White House counsel for basically the last 3 years of the Obama administration, as well as in the White House counsel's office. I wasn't the White House counsel, but I was in the White House counsel's office during the Clinton administration. And actually, I remember that then Judge Breyer's little tiny office was right next to mine in what was then called the old executive office building, as he was getting ready for his hearings and going through the process. And I got to know him during all of that. And I agree with Carrie that two things are going to make this topic that we're talking about today quite intense. I think the fact that President Trump got 3 nominees is creating some unrest. I think the other thing that's happened is the Supreme Court just granted cert on an abortion case, which is going to really highlight the country on the membership of the court and stare decisis and all sorts of issues that the justices are now going to have to confront. I'm not going to speak that much, maybe a little bit here at the very end about the recent commission, but let me just touch on some other issues quite quickly, because I know most of the audience wants to get us to get to the Q&A and bantering phase, which is, I think, Carrie, although you're closer to all this than I am, so maybe you're right and I'm wrong, but I thought President Biden is now has 20 nominees. I think he had 2 more last week. I think he's up to 20. What's most interesting is he had promised this, and it turns out to be true, is that he's really focused on diversity and different kinds of diversity. Of the first 5 nominees, I think all of them were people of color. There have been Native Americans, someone from Puerto Rico recently nominated to the First Circuit, many more women. And in addition, the other kind of diversity, there's been significant diversity on background. And that is not for the first time, but a real accent on people with different kinds of employment background, including federal public defenders, plaintiffs' lawyers, civil rights lawyers. Typically, the people who have populated federal courts have been former U.S. attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys, and frankly, people at big law firms like the one I'm at and at the one Boyd & Gray used to be at before he started his own firm, think that President Biden is looking for very different kinds of people to nominate to the bench. I might point out that I believe this is true, that President Trump, in his 4 years, despite all the nominees that he had, did not nominate a single person of color to the Court of Appeals. And I think that President Biden is looking to right the balance of the composition of our federal courts. I think already, as I've heard from people involved in the process, that the Biden nominees are changing who's applying, that people who are people of color and people with different kinds of backgrounds than what's been traditional are now for the first time thinking, I have a shot at this and I'm going to apply. And I think that we'll see more and more applications from highly qualified people with different kinds of backgrounds than what we have usually seen. So Carrie talked a little bit about the role of the ABA, and actually, I think for very different reasons than Carrie, agree that it was time to end the ABA's role in the process. But as I say, I think probably very different than Carrie. I think they just took too long. And as a President Biden supporter, the vote in the Senate now, or the makeup of the Senate now, is 50-50 with Vice President Harris casting deciding votes. Who knows what's going to happen after the midterms? And I just don't think that the Democrats have time to wait for the months and months that it always took the ABA to make their decision before the nominations took place. I think that what the ABA is doing is what it probably ought to be doing, is continuing to do an evaluation, but they don't get the names in advance, and the nomination held up until they come back. And I think that that's appropriate. I do think that they have an important role in the process. I think 10 of President Trump's nominees were ranked unqualified. I think they were nearly all confirmed anyway. I think most of the 10, and I think I'm right on this, I think most of the 10 were district judges who were nominated to be district judges and had basically never set foot in a courtroom before and had never been involved in the litigation process, and the ABA routinely recommended against them. I think Judge Walker is probably an example. When he was nominated to the district court, I think the ABA came out again, if I'm remembering this right, the ABA came out against him. But when he was nominated to the Court of Appeals, I think he was deemed qualified because he was qualified for the Court of Appeals job, but he wasn't qualified to be a district judge when he had never really been a district court litigator. In any event, so I agree actually that it was time to take the ABA out of the process. Let me just say, sort of finally, before we open it up, that, and I don't really know what to do with this, but I'm sort of increasingly concerned about the confirmation process. You know, presidents typically lose the Senate if they still have the Senate in their last 2 years, they typically lose the Senate in their last 2 years of an 8-year presidency. It didn't happen to President Trump because he only had a 4-year presidency, but typically presidents, I think, lose the Senate their last 2 years of an 8-year term. In President Bush's last 2 years, he had 10 circuit court confirmations and 58 district court confirmations. In Obama's last 2 years, when I was White House counsel, Obama had 2 circuit court confirmations. Bush had 10. And Obama had 18 district court confirmations. And of the 18, 9 of them were from states with 2 Republican senators. And it was palpable how much really there'd been a slowdown in the confirmation process in the last 2 years when the Republicans took the Senate. As we all know quite well, and Kerry was heavily involved in this, when Justice Scalia died, the Senate refused even to hold a hearing for Judge Garland, then Chief Judge Garland, because Obama was in the last year of his term, and yet the Senate held a hearing for Judge Barrett with only weeks left before the election, and obviously it was weeks left in the constitutionally provided term. The president gets 1 term and then has to run again and be reelected to get a second term. I'm really quite worried about this process and whether we're getting to ourselves in a situation where there will be very few judges confirmed if the president and the Senate are not members of the same political party. And let me just touch base for a little bit on this commission. Look, I have a little trouble getting all that interested in all this because unless the filibuster is abandoned, none of this is going to, whatever the commission comes up with, nothing's going to get through the Senate anyway. It's not going to get through on reconciliation. It's not a financial bill, and so there'll be some discussion of it, but I don't think anything's really going to happen. I also think that the commission's mandate, as I looked into it, is quite narrow. Now, look, they can write whatever they want, but I think the mandate is not really even to come up with recommendations, but to analyze various different issues and things like that. And last, Kerry, I just can't resist. I made a note when you said this. You talked about intimidation of judges. You know, we just finished 4 years of the president calling out judges by name and calling them not able to sit on his cases because his parents were from Mexico, even though he was born in my home state of Indiana. He talked about my judges on the Supreme Court are going to save the election. I think the record of his lack of respect for judges who countered him was truly remarkable by President Trump. And the notion that a few people with some interest groups are intimidating judges as opposed to what President Trump did. Look, I'm just sorry. I'm not really there with you on that. And we'll probably come back to the Breyer stuff, but let me turn it over now to Boyd and Gray.
Thank you very much, Neil. I want to make just a couple of simple points, some with reference to what you just said. I share your view about the polarization of the nomination process. I think it's gotten worse over the years that I've been involved, officially and unofficially, and I think that's a real danger. I don't even think it was polarized even in the Bork saga, or even Thomas for that matter. Justice Ginsburg told me not long before she died that the mistake Reagan made was nominating Scalia first and Bork second. If she had nominated Bork first, he would have gotten some of the first nominee deference and might have been confirmed. Scalia could have been confirmed at any time under any circumstances in any country. So it was sort of a wasted, vote in a sense to have him up there first. And she liked Bork. I mean, they got along very well together. When Thomas came along, the Republicans, you talk about losing the Senate in midway. Bush 41 never had a Republican Senate, and there never were enough votes to confirm Thomas without Democratic support, without bipartisan support. So even then, I think the horror of to us anyway, to me anyway, of the Thomas episode is that it was Kennedy, Messenbaum, and Simon who were on the Labor and Education Committee who really understood his threat to what a lot of liberals wanted, which was race by the numbers, hiring by the numbers, and he was opposed to that, and that was why they went after him. But it wasn't uniformly bipartisan, and in either case, Bork or Thomas, was the filibuster even threatened, let alone used. They could have stopped Thomas easily if they had insisted on a 60 vote margin, but it was just not even discussed. And we never had 60 votes. We had 57, 58, but never 60. The filibuster became something of a football shortly thereafter, and in the early 2000s with Bush 43's nominees. And I don't really know who, Carrie, you were saying was Professor Tribe. I'm not really sure I really know who kicked it off, but I'm told that several Democrats were suspicious of it and didn't really support it all that strongly, but it held up. And it wasn't until a bunch of us started threatening the so-called nuclear option that we got a resolution, a temporary resolution by the Gang of 14, a senator from Florida and John McCain leading the way on that, which allowed the Bush nominees, which included Roberts and Kavanaugh, to get through and get confirmed. Even Roberts, though, was nominated by Bush 41 in January of 1991, and he never got a hearing the whole year. So even though it was obviously for the D.C. Circuit and not the Supreme Court, it is sort of a telling indication of the way things work in the last year when the White House doesn't control, or the White House is not in the same party as the Senate. The nuclear option worked to get these nominees through. Later, it hit me hard because I'd been nominated to be ambassador to the EU, and many of you may not know this, but Reid said whoever threatened the nuclear option is never going to be allowed to be confirmed by me. So I had to be recessed. Yet just several months later, he invoked the nuclear option to break the filibuster for primarily for the D.C. Circuit, with Mitch McConnell warning that what goes around comes around. You may regret this. And so when he got in the majority position, McConnell did the same thing that Reid did. And so, but nevertheless, filibusters in the context of judicial nominations, not legislative affairs, but judicial, had a very short life. The filibuster in terms of legislative issues, that has a much longer history, a much longer tradition, and I think that's going to be very difficult to break. And of course, personally, I guess I would say I hope Manchin holds firm, but I think it would be a mistake, and I think that even Justice Ginsburg and now Justice Breyer have expressed doubts about court packing. So I frankly don't think it's going to happen. But there we are. But I did want to make the point that, in a sense, I do think the nomination process has gotten more polarized over the years. So I'll turn it back at this point to Judge Oldham for the audience questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Gray. So we'll move to Q&A. As a reminder, we're only taking questions through AirMeet. There's no way to ask speakers questions through other platforms. So please use the AirMeet functions that are on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, the easiest way to do it is the raise hand function, which I can just call on you. Otherwise, feel free to type into the Q&A box, into the Q&A feed if you're more comfortable doing that, and I can just read those questions. So as the audience is preparing to ask questions, let me kick us off by asking the panel. It seems like all three of you had things to say about the difficulties confronting the status quo and the process that we have today. But amongst this panel, we have a wealth of information and knowledge and experience of advising presidents and participating in the judicial nomination process in other ways. I'm curious if you could change something to make it better in your view. What would you do? Why don't we start with Mrs. Severino?
It might be the time, we might be to a point at this point where even just having these hearings is so much kabuki theater that we need to move on from that. It has gotten to be almost a strange exercise. So that's just one thing that it gets frustrating to watch sometimes. I don't know. I don't know how valuable you thought your own confirmation hearing was, or how valuable it was to the senators. But it seems like there's minimal gained through that process nowadays.
Mr. Eggleston? Oh, Neil, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
I knew I was going to do that. I just didn't know I'd do it quite so early in the process. So thanks, Judge. And thanks to the people who pointed out I made a mistake in my opening remarks. You should never rely on associates to do your research for you. It's just a mess. So anyway, so Carrie, I really hadn't thought about that as a possible issue. There are some examples, though, where it's been effective. And you probably, again, remember better than I do when Senator Kennedy was questioning one of the nominees who then blew up because he sort of didn't know any principles, and Kennedy made it clear that he wasn't going to vote for him. And that I think that mattered. I actually think, and interesting to hear what Boyd might say about this, but unlike Garland, Bork got his hearing, and it didn't go very well. And so the American people had a chance to hear him and hear his views, and it just didn't go very well. So I think, it continues to have a role. But Judge, I'm not sure what you would do, because I think it's all part of a bigger problem that I don't really know how to solve. I do think that let me just give you an example. So obviously in the last 2 years, there were states that had 2 Republican senators, and I would work with them to identify, I remind them periodically that this process doesn't start until the president makes a nomination. They can sort of have anybody they want to be their judge, but unless the president nominates them, there's no real role. And we worked together and identified some really terrific people that then didn't move forward and didn't get hearings. And yet I was later told by some of them, as I ran into various places, that once President Trump was in office, a number of them were renominated by President Trump and confirmed. And so you sort of think to yourself, well, then, kind of what was that all about? And so I just think this is part of a bigger problem. In some weird way, the fact that there's no longer a filibuster means that the other party has free rein to not support the nominee, because the person can get put on the bench. And in many of these, there are tremendous judicial emergencies where there's a real need for judges, so that the senators really have a desire to get the right people and get them in. And most of these are just upstanding people who are trying to do the best jobs that they can. So I don't really know. Sorry, Judge, that's kind of a rambly answer, but I don't quite know what to do. And it's part of the overall symbol of partisanship. And I think that's really in some ways the issue.
Ambassador Gray, do you have a magic bullet that would change it in your view?
No, I have no magic bullet, but I do think that this polarization will eventually end, and it won't be necessarily the judges which trigger the end of it, but it's not going to continue, I think, forever. And so I think hearings are useful, and the Bork example, I can remember I had no role in it. I was working for the vice president at the time, but he refused to do any moot court sort of practice, and that was just very apparent when he went through the hearing. So it wasn't automatic that he was going to get defeated, or get rejected. But today it is party line. It's pretty close to party line, and I think it's a general overall sort of cultural, political situation we're in, and it's not just judges in the judicial process that gets compromised. It's a lot more. So I hope it will resolve itself, but I have no bullet.
Let's go up to our first question from the audience. Jeffrey Wood asks whether and to what extent the Presidential Commission, which at least a couple of the panel members have touched on, is intended to act as a sword of Damocles that is in some ways operating over the Supreme Court of the United States. Does anyone subscribe to that theory?
Well, I think that's a little bit what I was talking about with the intimidation process that it seems like we have here. We had, back in, I think it was 2019, the brief that was filed by Senator Whitehouse and several of his Democratic senator colleagues, who that basically said if the court doesn't moot this case, we may be forced to move forward on court reform. And I think everyone knew they were talking about court packing specifically. And so it has been sort of used as a threat to the justices. And you know what? Actually, they did end up responding the way that Whitehouse said. And Justice Alito's amicus or his dissent in that case kind of enough one to believe that maybe he thought that could have had some impact on the way the justices voted in that Second Amendment case. And then lo and behold, look, they did exactly what they were asked to. And nonetheless, we're getting these talks of court reform now. And I agree with Ambassador Gray. I think as long as Joe Manchin holds firm, it isn't likely to move. But I think it's nonetheless functions as that kind of threat to the court. Now, it maybe is a threat that is uniquely worrisome to the Chief Justice, and he's not the swing vote anymore. So perhaps we have a little less to worry. But I think it's disturbing to me to see that held out there as a threat in terms of this fears that there could be a switch in time to try to avoid this kind of process. I think the best way for them to minimize the danger of these kind of process would be simply to try to ignore it and not feed these mafiosi kind of techniques by giving into them. As the mother of a toddler, I can tell you that when you give into that kind of threats and tantrums, you only get more of that behavior. So I'm hoping that the left isn't thinking that this is something that's going to be a successful technique.
So, Judge, look, I doubt that Justice Thomas, Justice Barrett, Justice Alito, even the Chief Justice care anything about this, sort of movement. And they're pretty much, I think, going to decide the case the way they think the cases ought to be decided. So I don't really think of this as much of an intimidation tactic. And Kerry, I did follow a little bit. I know that some of the justices dissented, but that New York case was so plainly moot. I mean, basically, New York City had abolished whatever regulation it was. New York State had passed a law that said that New York City couldn't pass a new regulation. The case was completely moot. And I think White House was just concerned, are they so anxious to get to a Second Amendment case, are they going to go ahead and decide it even though it's plainly moot? And the other thing, which I think they probably largely figured out, is since there's an entire industry built around bringing Second Amendment cases to the court, they didn't need that one. There was always going to be some other one, and now obviously they've taken a surge in one, and so they're going to get their opportunity to do it. So I think they're going to decide the cases the way they want to decide them, and look, I'm sort of with Boyden on this. I'm not actually a big fan of, I have to say, of abolishing the filibuster. All presidents who have the House and have less than 60 in the Senate want to abolish the filibuster, because if they could just abolish the filibuster, they could get more done. And I get that, and they care sort of more about their presidency. But as a Democrat, I would not have been happy if there had been no filibuster, and President Trump in his first 2 years had the House, the Senate, and he was obviously the president. And sometimes the sort of parties forget how quickly everything changes in Washington. So I'm not actually a supporter of that at all. And I know I'm contrary to a number of the people on my side of the line in connection with that. But I think this is, as Boyden said, I think this is just an area where the parties just have to work things out. We've sort of gotten ourselves into a position where financial related stuff they can get through on reconciliation is passed, and the NDAA is passed. The National Defense Authorization Act is passed. And then in addition to that, they name post offices. And it's sort of a sad state of affairs. And we would obviously like to see some movement. And I hope Boyden's right, at some point we get out of this mess.
Well, I would add just one little thought that, looking back at history, I think Caro's book about Lyndon Johnson points this out, that in and about before and after Kennedy's assassination, there was a real partisan freeze, and I think a year went by with no major legislation being passed at all. People have forgotten about that entirely, but it resolved itself eventually. And so I just think that if history's any guide, this too will pass.
Let's go to our first raised hand. It's from Dean Reuter from the Federalist Society.
Hi, thank you, Judge. I'm only interjecting here because I didn't see any other questions in the queue, and I'm trying to demonstrate to our audience how easy it is to ask a question live, which I encourage. My question is sort of a Goldilocks question, because I've heard from both sides criticisms of judges appointed, and especially justices, appointed by their political parties, that their judges are insufficiently decisive, that they're dodging cases, that they're either not granting cert or they're deciding on too narrow grounds. I've also heard at the same time, the court exercises way too much power, is in everybody's everyday life. So is it too little power, too much power, just right? I'm interested in the opinion of the panelists.
I'll jump in and we can keep on going in order. I think part of the problem that there's too much power that rests with the Supreme Court is that right now, compared to the way that the country was when our Constitution was set up, there's just disproportionately too much power in the federal government altogether. So that then makes the federal Supreme Court disproportionately significant. Whereas I think at the time of the founding, you would have had a lot more significance for state courts and frankly, all sorts of other jobs. You can kind of see that by the fact that historically some Supreme Court justices left to do other things like, run for governor or something like that. So it wasn't as deciding every issue that came to the up in the country. I mean, they certainly wouldn't have thought they could have been deciding what the national healthcare policy was, or whether abortion could be criminalized, or things like that certainly wouldn't have entered the mind of the founders. And I think also, and then that example brings that up as well, there are issues that have been constitutionalized that otherwise wouldn't be decided by the court. So I think there are a lot of issues that in fact are not actually addressed in the Constitution, but because of expansive evolving readings of the Constitution, maybe we have brought into that process. And as a side note on the importance of state Supreme Courts, I appreciated Neil Eggleston's comments on the diversity of Biden nominees, but I'll point out there are different types of diversity of background that Trump, I think, was excellent on, and having state Supreme Court justices was really one of them. I don't think that historically has been something where you have seen as much, but off the top of my head, I could think of Allison Ide, Britt Grant, Dave Strauss, Barbara Lagoa, Robert Luck, Joan Larson. There's a ton of these judges who have that state experience that is, I think, relatively unique in the federal judiciary. Not to mention, you have different types of backgrounds, like mothers of many, which as a mother of six, I appreciate, like Sarah Pitlick, or obviously Justice Amy Coney Barrett, people who have worked in civil rights from a conservative perspective, people like Kyle Duncan at Beckett Law, people who are ordained religious, which is interesting. We have Stephanos Bibas in the Second Circuit, who is an Eastern Orthodox deacon. Joseph Bianco is a Catholic deacon, and then a lot of former state SGs, including people like our moderator here, who worked as a deputy SG of Texas, but people like Lawrence Van Dyke or Andrew Brasher or Kevin Newsom. So that diversity and some of that state experience, I think, is valuable as well.
So Dean, just to sort of come back to your question, I would like the Supreme Court kind of to continue, or not continue. I would like them to recognize they're one of a very long series of justices, and there are going to be a lot of justices after them. And that we come out of a rule of law kind of system where we rely on prior case law that to sort of develop the law or whatever. And I'm sort of troubled by this kind of rethinking every issue that comes up, as if the justice for the first time has come up with the right answer, and all the justices that came before didn't come up with the right answer. And I really just think that they should decide questions fairly narrowly. As I said in the gun case, there's always going to be another one, right? There's always going to be another abortion-related case. There's going to be another restriction. They ought to be deciding these issues fairly narrowly, I think, and incrementally. And I think the country would be better off, and I think the role of the judiciary, which frankly ought to be fairly limited. There's another sort of thing that's happening, and I'm going to raise this, and I'm a little worried that chat is going to light up and tell me I'm wrong again, but I'm just going to do it anyway, which is sort of justices and academics always talk about, well, the court is kind of limited jurisdiction. It can only really deal with the cases that are brought in front of it, and so it has a kind of a limited power to it because it's limited to the cases in front of it. But it's my impression, and this is where the chat function may light up, that the Republican or the conservative justices are frequently inviting another case, that they write a concurrence to say, I think this is an issue we should look into, and I'm looking for an appropriate case to do it. And as a result of that, the sort of conservative bar goes out and looks to find a case to bring it to the court. And I think that that's sort of an odd in the context of a court that is supposed to only decide cases that have Article 3 standing, and it was a method really of limiting its jurisdiction. Anyway, I think I'm right on that, that it's more of a conservative thing than not. But again, that's an impression sitting here, and maybe not.
One comment that I would have is that this question about the court's power goes back to the very, very beginning. And I think it was Tocqueville made the famous observation, said one of the geniuses of the American system is their capacity to turn all difficult political issues into judicial ones, resolvable by a tenured judiciary. And so this has been around, this question of who can do what and who has the power is as old as the Republic. And I think it's true. I remember Justice O'Connor having a seminar on this at some point. I think it's true that Hamilton and Washington picked the first Chief Justice because they knew he would stand up to states like New York and Virginia, who love to interfere with interstate commerce and have their own sort of monopoly kind of enterprises. And Chief Justice did that. That's one of the dormant commerce clause. Well, that came out of nowhere. And so I think it's ebbed and flowed and back and forth. And Neil, I think there are Democratic nominee justices who every now and then hinted it would be nice to see a case. But whatever the outside groups do to try to tee up cases, they still have to meet all the standing requirements. And I would say justiciability and everything else, rightness. And I would say that those rules remain, pretty strict even now.
If I could just follow up, I think it may be true that right now, the justice in the court most likely to do that. I feel like it's probably Thomas and maybe Alito are the ones most likely to do that, are the conservatives. I do think historically, I think if, for example, in death penalty jurisprudence, you have justices who are sort of inviting, hey, let's take the next step on this, even just with their dissents from denial of cert or something. At this point, maybe it wouldn't make sense for them to invite new cases if they don't think they're going to be on the prevailing side of it. But certainly, historically, the idea that people would go out and look for plaintiffs to address things, that's something that I think is common to most of the civil rights era cases. I mean, this is just a common feature of litigation, and I think if anything, probably was first developed by some of the groups on the left before then groups on the right started to employ those same techniques. But as Ambassador Gray pointed out, you still have to meet standing requirements. So you can't just bring any old person. If they don't really have a case, the court can't hear it.
Thanks very much. Jorge Perez, has a question that goes back to something that Mrs. Severino had said earlier about the hearings. And he asks whether it would make the process better to just not have cameras, to do the hearings in private as Congress can in other circumstances. Are the cameras part of the problem, or has this ever been explored that anyone's aware of?
It's an interesting thought. It would be fewer signs that people put up, which I think are particularly distracting from the topic. And one other, following Neil's comment, one other thought I had was part of these judicial emergency problem that we have here is blue slips, and that's another area that could be done away with, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that generally, where you see the judicial emergencies, certainly that was the case, that a lot of judicial emergencies persisted through the Trump era because people like the California senators, for example, were blocking his nominees. And I'm sure it probably goes both ways, but if you got rid of the blue slips for district court judges, you might have some of those seats filled more quickly, and maybe with people that the administration was happier with.
Yeah. What of that? Do you think that would be the sort of a solution that might help, or do you think it would hurt? Neil, what do you think?
So I think that this is another example of where the Democrats in the Senate have kept the process that the Republicans adopted under when they had the Senate under President Trump, which is blue slips are still being honored for district judges, I think U.S. attorneys, I think U.S. marshals, but not really being honored for Court of Appeals judges. I think that's sort of where they've ended up. That kind of made sense to me. It seemed kind of weird to me at the time I was White House counsel that somebody is being nominated to the Second Circuit. They may be filling a seat that had come out of New York, but they're not a New York judge anymore. They cover the entire Second Circuit, which is Connecticut, Vermont. And so to treat it kind of as owned by a particular judge seemed a little strange to me. I just don't. I mean, this may be an area where sort of comedy, even in this area, there may be enough comedy among senators that, if it happens if they got rid of it. I mean, this is a form. I'm going to use the word patronage, but I don't mean it in the evil sense. But this is something senators can do for constituents, and so I think part of the reason that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have sort of taken away the blue slip as to senators when it's a district judge who's literally in the state that senator represents. I think this could also be one of these where taking that away sort of is going to end up damaging everybody, and so I just don't know that it's all that helpful, really. I talked to before we lost the Senate, I talked to Senator Grassley, who was chair of the Judiciary Committee, about whether he'd be willing to get rid of the blue slips. And he just felt quite strongly that this was an issue that senators had a level of comity on, and that senators should respect each other. And that's sort of his view. And this was another example of something, there was nothing the White House could do about it, independent of what the Senate was going to do about it. So, we can nominate anybody we want, but if the Senate is going to agree they're not going to go forward unless there's a blue slip, there's nothing that the White House can really do about it.
Boyd, I was going to ask you, obviously, if you have any response to that, it would be great. But I'm also curious. I've heard all kinds of different information about the state of the blue slip in previous administrations, and I'm curious, when you were in the thick of this, in the Reagan years and the Bush years, the H.W. Bush years anyway, were the blue slips honored for all of these judgeships, or is this are these innovations of more modern time?
Well, my recollection is there may be faults, there may be, frayed, but I think we honored blue slips for district court judges, but not for appellate. So, and I don't remember there being a big stink about that. We didn't actually, of course, have, in the Bush years, Bush 41, control of the Senate. That sort of dominated the blue slip process. The fact you don't control the body means you have to go with who you think you can get confirmed. Confirmability was a major factor, but it wasn't a blue slip factor. It was the fact that we didn't control the Senate.
We have a question from Rachel Morrison, and she says, what do the panelists think are the qualifications a judge should have to be nominated and confirmed? Are race and sex important considerations? If so, to what extent should they be considered, presumably with other variables? How do you measure their important weights? Why don't we just keep going in order? We'll go 1, 2, 3.
I think the real consideration should be the person's experience, their qualifications, and chief among those is that they have a judicial philosophy that is faithful to the Constitution. I don't think that people's race and sex should be a major factor in that. I think that's, to my mind, contrary to my understanding of what I would like for our country in terms of color blindness. I'd rather have that not be considered. I'd rather have people's sex not be ruling them in or out. I would like our country to have, the best judges. And I think what we see is that's going to end up covering a wide and diverse swath of individuals. But first and foremost is going to be how they approach their job as a judge, and are they able to do that and able to do that faithfully to the Constitution.
So obviously, in this process, you're looking for the best people for the job. But in my view, look, on any of these positions, there are probably 50 people in the community who could be an excellent judge. And I think Carrie and I would agree that it should be someone who's going to follow the Constitution. I think she and I would violently disagree what that means. I think, but I think we would both agree that a qualification is that they agree to follow the Constitution, sort of a basic qualification of the job. But I think that President Trump said, if I get another Supreme Court nominee, it's going to be a woman, I think. And then he nominated Amy Coney Barrett. I don't remember Kerry coming out and saying, "Oh, Judge, you can't," or, President, you can't do that. It's got to be a man. So I think that having a judiciary that looks a little bit more like the country is an important factor. And when I say looks like, I mean gender, race, ethnic background, what we used to call grandiosely maybe experiential diversity, and have this sort of different kinds of backgrounds. Kerry's right that President Trump did look to the state courts more than had been traditional, and but to think that having a judiciary that looks more like the people that are going to appear in front of judges, I think that's a factor worth considering, because I think a lot of people can perform these jobs and perform them quite well. And so it's not like you're deciding on one single person. And I think these are values that are important and should be highlighted, and that President Biden is right to focus on them.
I just would add simply that, since the time I was involved, the strength of the bench, as it were, has greatly expanded, and to include more corporate outs in gender than perhaps on other grounds. But there are plenty of good people to pick from all kinds of diverse backgrounds that really weren't available, say, 30 years ago. And I think that's it's a tribute to the law schools. It's, I like to sort of say the Federalist Society has helped with the diversity on philosophical grounds. But I think there are a lot more candidates of great ability who are available now and are anxious to do it and willing to do it than were 30 or 40 years ago.
We got another question in the Q&A feed that harkens back to a topic that at least two of you have raised, which is that some of the issues associated with judicial nominations and confirmations may be, in the minds of some, connected to the things that judges do, whether it's in deciding cases or what cases to decide. And one of our questioners asks, are there any movements afoot to regulate things like basically Title 28 of the United States Code, which regulates judicial jurisdiction? It regulates the sorts of cases and procedures that judges use in deciding these cases. As someone who's not inside the Beltway and doesn't pay as much attention to these as others do, I'm curious if that's part of the conversation going on in Washington.
Maybe, Carrie, just to break up the order, I'll just jump in here so that they don't hear it. So I think one of the things that this commission is supposed to look at is this issue, not so much of jurisdiction, but of what kinds of cases the Supreme Court should take, and sort of reduce, I think, its discretion, have more mandatory appeal cases than it has now. I think that's one of the things that they're going to look into. I don't actually have a view on that. I don't know really enough about it. So I don't personally have a view, but I think that's one of the things that this commission is going to be looking into. And maybe we could just take a little poll while we do this, which is because I think Boyd and Carrie and I sort of cover 3 generations of Supreme Court law clerks. So when I was a law clerk, which was to Chief Justice Berger 79, OT 79, 80, again, I don't remember exactly, but the court had something like 140, 150 merits opinions during the course of the year. I think maybe they were down to 60 or something last year. I don't know what they have. Carrie, you probably know better than I do. Boyden, I think you may have actually even had more when merits decisions in sort of the era that you clerked. And Carrie, I don't know, lost track when you were, whether you're part of the downward slope or whether the slope had already gone down or what.
Well, when I clerked, I think there were, in that range, 100, 140, 150. And we had fewer law clerks. Remember that too. And there was no fax machine. This is sort of maybe a frivolous point, but the head of the Appropriations Committee in the House didn't like Warren, and so refused to appropriate money for a fax machine. So that led to the so-called flimsies, which were done by the Chief Justice's law clerks, and they would type up their recommendations for the informal pauperous petitions, and then the secretaries would take over with very thin onion paper and make 10 copies. That's why they were called flimsy, not because the evidence was flimsy, but because the paper was flimsy. I don't know how, with more than double the caseload today then as now, how we did all that with maybe half the number of law clerks or 2/3 the number of law clerks. I'm sort of astounded, but maybe we worked harder. I don't know.
I'm amazed that not only without a fax machine, but my gosh, without Westlaw or Lexis. I mean, I honestly, hats off to all of the justices and clerks who were able to accomplish that. I know Justice Thomas used to talk about when he came on the court, there were like 120 cases a term. And he's like, we heard cases in the morning and we heard cases in the afternoon. And now it's this term, actually, it was down to 58. So even less than 60. I think we were in the 70s. I clerked in 2007, 2008. So, but I agree. I think it's a little nuts. Justice Thomas actually would joke that he thinks maybe if they heard more cases, they'd have less time to be making stuff up on the side. And maybe it would be better if we could just let's have fewer random, other meanderings of the court, and if you got to sit there and get focused on doing your work, if you're gonna crank out over 100 cases in a sitting. One of the interesting things, I remember Chief Justice Roberts, or getting the impression that when he started, he kind of wanted to up the number of cases. And obviously this last year or so has been kind of a blip for other reasons, but it is interesting because they have not gone up at all. They have been this steady decline, and it's kind of frustrating. My personal thought as to part of the reason for that might have to do with just the internal factor of the way that cert is granted and the way the cert pool works. Because as a clerk working on the cert pool, where you're writing, and just for everyone who isn't familiar, the way it works is the justices who are in the pool, and I think now that's 7 of the 9 or maybe 8. All of those cert petitions, and it's 5,000, 6,000 petitions a year, are divided amongst all of their clerks, and then they write one memo that goes to all of the justices in that pool. So they're not just giving advice to their own justice, they have to write a memo for everyone. And I feel like it makes the stakes a lot higher in terms of recommending a grant, because that like 99% of these are going to be a no. And so if you're going to recommend you should grant the case, that's a really big standard. So I think it gives this clerks even higher incentive to be looking for reasons to bump it. It's a vehicle problem, or it's a this, or it's a that. Not a big enough split. Let it have time to percolate. Oft denied, which I always think is kind of a funny thing, because some of the oft denied things are things that maybe shouldn't be oft denied. But once you, it's like friend zoning someone. Once they get in the oft denied zone, now that's just kind of a line that would get into the thing, and everyone thinks, oh, no one's going to ever grant on this issue. So maybe that internal process is kind of helps reinforce a getting to know approach rather than getting to yes on the cert petitions. But at the end of the day, you got to talk 4 justices into doing it, and I don't know how to get them to switch from their negative approach to cert, because I do think there's a lot of issues that could stand to be considered by the Supreme Court. I think maybe part of it is this sort of intimidation-y kind of feel thing. There's too much concern about this is going to be a big issue for the court. And every time when they took the Dodd's case, the abortion case, everyone's like, oh, this is going to be big in the election. It's going to get the court in the crosshairs. That kind of rhetoric about every major case you take hopefully isn't affecting them. But to the extent that it is, the justices are like, oh my gosh, I don't want to wade into this territory, whatever side, either side you're on. It's like, we don't want to be here because they're not on the court because they're politicians that ran for office. They're on the court because they like being behind the scenes more, I think. So, I feel like that doesn't help the process.
One of the topics that we haven't really touched on is the various division of labor that is associated with judicial nomination and confirmations. So obviously the counsel's office, then there's the Justice Department and the Office of Legal Policy. There's obviously Senate and Senate staffs, Senate Judiciary Committee, et cetera. I'm curious, given, I think as Mr. Eggleston had pointed out, we have 3 different generations of people who have participated in this process as law clerks and as staffers of various kinds. How that has changed over time. If it has changed over time, does it change by administration? Does it change based on sort of the political breakdown in Washington? Is there some level of constancy as to who does what and how it works? And or is it really all just driven by the people that are in those various offices? Any thoughts about the division of labor?
Well, I would say that just a simple thing that I think more and more of the authority has been transferred over the years from the department to the White House counsel's office. Neil may not agree with that, or Carrie, but that's been my impression. And I sort of lived through some of that as it was changing, and there was some friction with justice, but not much. I don't think, but the decision making, I think, is now squarely in the hands of the White House counsel's office. That's my impression.
So I can talk about it when I was there. I know less about it now, although my ethics deputy is now the White House counsel, Dana Remus, and the person doing judges, I think, is Paige Herwig, who did judges for me before she went to the Justice Department. So it's probably pretty similar. Look, I mean, when we did this, I was the memo to the president recommending that he nominate somebody. So that was me writing to the president, we recommend that you nominate this person. And so that was me on the line. And so it was important to me that this is, because he would call me in every once in a while and say, like, really, what is this about? And who is this? And why should I do this? And this person has the following issues. And so I was personally on the line for these. And whenever I made a recommendation, I had to be ready to go down and talk to him and tell him why it was. And so I think there's a sense in which that focuses the mind a little bit. And because the ultimate responsibility was really on me to make that recommendation and defend it if the president wanted to understand why I'd made the recommendation. But I agree with Boyden. My sense is that more of that has been consolidated in the White House counsel's office over the years. I had the impression, and Carrie, you may know better than I do, that in the Trump era, the Department of Justice was more involved than it had been. Despite, sort of the notion that the White House counsel writes the ultimate memo, but the Department of Justice was more heavily than it had previously been in the recent past in the process. But that's just an impression. It's not like they consulted with me, so I don't know for sure.
My impression, just based on particularly looking at it for justice on trial and looking at the Supreme Court vetting process, is that it did seem to be very, very tightly controlled within the White House counsel's office. I can't say that, my impression is that went through, appellate court nominees and lower court nominees as well. Although I'm assuming the more White House counsel focus might have been heavier on at least in terms of the initial vetting process, might have been heavier on the White House counsel for Supreme Court nominees than others. But I can't speak to the historical changes, really, having looked at it more over a shorter period of time. Obviously, the DOJ had a huge role in other aspects of the process, but I'm just thinking about the upfront vetting. But again, I know more about that with the Supreme Court than with the other levels.
Yeah, let me just be clear. When I said I thought maybe in the Trump administration there was a little less, I was not talking about the Supreme Court nominations. I think that's always very focused and centralized in the White House. I was really thinking, I had the impression it was a little less at the district judge and court of appeals level, but again, I'm not sure about that.
Great. We have a raised hand from Kenneth Marcus, if we can activate his mic.
Hi. Great presentations, everyone. I wonder if people would be interested in commenting on the tendency of presidents to nominate younger and younger judges to the federal judiciary, and whether that's a good thing in bringing either more age diversity or more energy to the judiciary, or whether it's a bad thing in that it would be helpful to have a greater amount of years of experience in people who become federal judges.
That's a great question. Whoever would like to go first, just jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a, I'm not sure that they've gone consistently younger. I think of Joseph Story, who was 32 when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. Even obviously that's an outlier, but I do think it's a process that does have there's a floor, and there's sort of a natural floor. Thinking from my perspective of looking at vetting people is you do want to find someone who's young and who's going to have a long time on the bench. But if you're looking for someone where you really understand the judicial philosophy, you simply don't. You need to have a certain amount of experience and life experience as well. And one of the things that Molly and I, for example, wrote about in our book in terms of things that people that they were looking for wasn't even just how have they articulated this philosophy, but having life experience of having shown that you know how to stand up to difficult experiences in your life or difficult opposition, because then you know that this is someone who has the backbone to do that when they're under the pressure that they would be in both a confirmation process and then also on the bench. And those are kind of things that it's going to be hard to find at too young of an age. So I feel like it's a process that is going to naturally end up stabilizing, somewhere in the middle.
So I agree with Carrie on that. I think there's kind of a natural, I'm about to say this, although I'm not sure what the age is, but you want them to have had enough experience that they're comfortable in whatever role they're going to have. I actually think that people shouldn't be nominated to be district judges unless they have experience in courtrooms, and some amount of experience in courtrooms. Judges shouldn't be learning, about trial practice as a judge, because they're supposed to be deciding trial practice, and so there has to be some amount of experience. I think that I suspect that if you graphed this, you'd probably see younger and younger over the last couple presidencies. I sometimes wonder whether these judges who are quite young are actually going to stay and serve out. As Justice Marshall used to say, I was confirmed to a life term and I intend to serve it out. I sort of wonder, as people have children who need to go to college and sort of financial, we don't pay these judges all that much. And it's sort of one thing for somebody who's 55 and has been practicing and maybe have some money put away. It's somebody else who's 35, probably hasn't put any money away and may end up with sort of financial obligations, whether they're, sort of how likely they are to stay for decades and decades on the bench. That's sort of a different issue and a different consideration. I assume they're all asked and they all say they're going to stay, but I'm a bit interested to see sort of empirically what happens over time on that. But I agree with Carrie. You want enough that you know what you're getting, and getting a young person who turns out not to be what you thought he or she was going to be, that's not a great outcome for somebody advising the president.
Master Gray, do you have any thoughts on the relative age or youth of nominees?
Well, all I can do is think of the anecdote about Oliver Wendell Holmes. I think they kind of had to sweet talk him off when he was in his 90s, but he certainly represented, the experience part of this. His famous line about the life of the law is not logic, but experience. And, so having life tenure and being able to stay on the court until you really weren't able to do it anymore was very important. There's this great anecdote of him walking to the court one day with Brandeis. Some pretty young girl walks by and he does a sort of a double take and says to Brandeis, to be 70 again. He kept his energy up until very late in life. And I don't, this is a question maybe about life tenure or putting term limits or whatever. I'm against that because Ruth Bader Ginsburg in some ways got wiser and wiser and wiser the older she got. So I'm not for term limits, and I'm not for confirming people who are too young to have, as Carrie's put it, life experience.
Yeah, I'm curious of our other two panelists if you've thought about term limits and obviously that's a constitutional question, but I'm curious if you think that would help or hurt in the as what you understand to be the concerns associated with the nominations and confirmations process.
I'm not opposed in principle. Obviously, it would be the challenge would be creating a system where you could institute term limits in a way that didn't have a disproportionate effect on one party or the other. The good news is, in order to pass a constitutional amendment, you do need a overwhelming and necessarily bipartisan support, I think, to get that level of support. So you would have to come up with a system that hopefully did it instituted it in such a way that it didn't preference one party over the other. So I'm definitely open to considering those ideas. I do think we have to be careful thinking about, okay, what's the problem that we think we're solving with term limits and make sure that we actually would be addressing the problem. I mean, I think there's one problem is the concern that people are staying until they're not able to function effectively, and I don't think we've actually seen that in recent retirements. I do think that Justice Ginsburg was functioning fine. I think Justice Breyer is functioning fine. So I don't think we're having the Justice Douglas issue of people overstaying their mental capacity to do so. But I do think it could provide some, consistency to be able to predict it. It's a challenging problem though to try to game out what the best system is without being unduly complicated. I think one of the reasons people stay on the court isn't even so much sometimes the political issues. It's just that it's such a great job and it's hard to let go of that incredible, not just power in a sense that they're trying to grasp power, but it's a thrilling thing to be making these important decisions. And when I was clerking, Justice O'Connor had retired not too many years before, and I felt like she didn't seem to be perfectly happy with having taken a back seat at that point. I often wonder whether that didn't influence Justice Ginsburg's decision not to retire, because watching Justice O'Connor, whose office was right across the hall from her at the time, I don't know where it stood more recently, but in kind of not being part of this process that she was part of for so long, didn't have an effect on her.
So to me, this is a little also another one of these in the category of not going to spend a lot of time thinking about it because it's not going to happen. I do agree with Carrie that I'm not entirely, unless we're back to the court packing issue, and if you could do it in a way that didn't advantage one party or the other, the notion that there's more turnover might put less sort of pressure on each individual selection, although I suspect that's actually not true, that even with a term limit, whoever's going to be there is going to be serving long enough that there'll be an enormous amount of attention and pressure. And I think also Carrie's right that there really hasn't been an issue where justices have stayed that in my knowledge and memory, let me put it that way, because there may be ones that I just don't know about or haven't really thought about. But other than Justice Douglas, who it was, I think everybody thought was quite fine until the very end. Justice Scalia died in office, but I think everybody thinks he was sharp as a tack until the end. It wasn't a mental capacity issue. Justice Breyer, obviously firing on all cylinders, as was Justice Ginsburg until her death. And so I'm not, unless we're going back and fixing some other problem, I'm not sure what that solution really accomplishes. As I say, since we're not gonna have a constitutional amendment, it's better discussing in my law school class probably.
Great, thanks. We have a raised hand from Roger Severino.
Hey, how are you? Question about Justice Breyer. There's been a campaign of sorts, especially from liberal media outlets and groups, to try to not so subtly pressure him to retire. And I'm wondering, in the experience of the panelists, how new is this development? Where does it end? And what is your reaction to it?
So why don't I take that one first? I know the people who are pushing this most actively. Chris Kang worked for me in the White House and did judges for me, and I know him, quite well. And look, when I was White House counsel, I thought about this in connection with Justice Ginsburg, and I just decided that I had nothing to add to the information that she already had, and sort of. And again, I'm talking now from the point of view as the White House counsel or coming to the White House. So I never talked to the president about it, but I just thought, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to call her and suggest to her that it's time for her to step down. It's unseemly. I'm not really going to do it. I kind of had the same reaction to this. I think Justice Breyer doesn't need, the liberal media and the sort of people, progressives like me, are not turning on him. He's, in our view, a fantastic justice, and we're not going to turn on him if he decides not to retire. And he's going to make whatever decision. It's entirely in his control, and he's going to make whatever decision he's going to make. And I don't think he's going to decide to retire because somebody's bought a van with retire Breyer and driving it around the Supreme Court. I think he's got the information he needs in order to make a decision about what he's going to do, and I think he's pretty much going to do it. The other sort of odd thing about the timing of all this is that if he were to retire today, there are a lot of cases yet to be decided, and you would lose his vote. And even if you confirm somebody before the end of the term, the tradition of the Supreme Court is that if a justice hasn't heard argument, the justice is not going to vote. So I don't know if there are 5-4 cases that would go some different direction, probably not so many anymore, but if he were actually to retire before the end of the term, he's out of voting and being part of the decision-making process before the end. And I would be quite surprised if he retired before the end of the term. Typically, when justices decide to do this, as Boyd and Kerry both know quite well, is that if they're going to retire, as opposed to Justice Scalia, obviously, who didn't make his own decision about it when he's going to leave the court, but they typically retire shortly after the end of the term. And so there's pressure on him. I'm just not really sure what the theory is here.
Yeah, I'll add that if he retired before the end of the term, it would also mean he has all these potentially decisions he's in the process of writing. Then who writes those decisions? So even if you're not the deciding vote, someone else has to pick up all this slack at the end. That doesn't strike me as likely. I assume even the people running the billboards can't imagine he's going to retire tomorrow. From my perspective, I agree with Neil. It's unseemly. It doesn't make sense to me as a practical matter either. I think if anything, that response, especially coming as it did almost immediately after Breyer's own rejection of court packing at a speech he gave at Harvard, and saying he didn't like the way this was politicized in the court, it makes it, I don't know if this is something they had planned before that and the timing just happened to be that way, or if it was specifically in response to it, but it does give the impression of hey, I do think a lot of people agree with Neil that they're not, we do still like you. We don't have no more use for you or something. But I think that was the impression that it gave from at least the people running these billboards, and some of the louder vociferous voices saying you need to retire now is, hey, we have no more use for you here. We want to just get someone younger to warm your seat. I don't think that's appropriate. And I think it also risks further politicizing that seat in the way that Breyer literally just said he doesn't want to do. So I think if anything, it's likely to be counterproductive. Follow-up question for Rogers. Who's watching the kids? If you're asking me a question on the panel, but I'm hoping they're okay. The house is not burning down.
Ambassador Gray, what do you think?
Well, the more pressure was put on, I think, on Ginsburg than is now being put on Breyer, from what I can remember. And I always admired Justice Ginsburg for not bowing to it, and I think Kerry had the right reason. I mean, it's the most interesting job in the world, and Bork almost dug his own grave when he said it was an intellectual feast, but that's exactly what it is. And if I were there, I wouldn't walk away from it. I don't care what kind of pressure would put on me. And I would walk away if I thought I was going cuckoo, but in recent years we just haven't seen that, and I think the court has a way of dealing with that, has shown it has a way of dealing with that on its own.
One story that I always loved relating to that is Justice Marshall had allegedly said to his clerks at one point, if I die, just prop me up and keep on voting. But then actually, when push came to shove in his own life, at one point, apparently it was his wife who reached out to him and said, I don't think you're still, I think now the time has come, you're really not able to do the job as well as you did. And he did step down. He stepped down, obviously, as Ambassador Gray knows, under President Bush, and that's why we have Justice Thomas in his place. So he was able to make that decision in a way that if you were doing it for purely strategic, ideological, or partisan reasons, you would have stayed there, right? But he made that choice in a very principled way, and I think that speaks a lot.
Well, I think we're out of time, and so I suppose we'll leave it at that. Our greatest thanks to each of our panelists for their scholarly and deeply experienced contributions to to the topics, and to the Federal Society for hosting this discussion. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dean.
Terrific. Thank you much. Thank you so much, Judge Oldham. And thank you to Carrie, Boyden, and Neil for your remarks and your insights. This has been a terrific final panel and a great conclusion to our Executive Branch Review Conference. I don't know how it is that I'm hoarse like I have been to the convention. I don't understand that, but I thank also all the week's participants and audience members for spending time with us during EBR 9 week. The entire proceedings have been recorded, so feel free to watch panels you might have missed on our website or another outlet, and feel free to share the links with those recordings with your friends. In important Federalist Society news, recent changes in COVID policy by the DC government make me cautiously optimistic about seeing all of you in person at this year's National Lawyers Convention, now scheduled for November 11th through the 13th in person at the Mayflower Hotel here in Washington, DC. So please mark your calendars, November 11th through 13th. But for now, please stand by for a few seconds for an alert directing you to join the lounge. I hope to see you there now. We are adjourned.